Good afternoon, everyone. Be very welcome to another activity of Ethos Conference 2020, live on Ethos Institute YouTube channel. I would like to thank the presence of our audience and especially our speakers and also our translators today. I'm Paula Oda, Project Coordinator at Ethos Institute, and in this panel we'll have the participation of Drago Kos, Chair of the OECD Working Group on Bribery in International Business Transactions and co-chair of MENA, OECD Business Integrity Network, and also Bruno Brandão, Executive Director of Transparency International in Brazil. Well, in the recent years, important improvements have been made in the integrity and anti-corruption agenda, especially in Brazil, both for institutions and the regulatory framework. However, it's notable that in the most recent years, around 2 to 3, there has been a capture of the anti-corruption agenda by political groups, especially in the last electoral race, but without the main principle of this agenda. So in the same period, we have also followed a series of changes in the main institutions responsible for fighting corruption. Considering this, the objective of this panel today is to promote a dialogue on the direction of the anti-corruption agenda, the legal framework, and the structures of preventing and suppressing corruption, especially here in Brazil. The Corruption Perception Index, released in January by Transparency International, recorded that the country remained at the worst level in the historical series. In its most recent report, Brazil's setbacks in the legal and institutional anti-corruption frameworks, the organization identified Brazil's serious setbacks in the fight against corruption. And in the 2020 Capacity to Combat Corruption Index of the Américas Society Council of the Americas and Control Risks, Brazil occupies the 4th position, with 10% of the overall score. For the index, the anti-corruption wave is receding dangerously in Latin America, and the pandemic and the emergency states imply even greater risks of corruption. And finally, on a technical visit to the country last year, the Working Group on Bribery in International Business of the OECD expressed the concern about the threat to fighting corruption in the country, affecting Brazil's ability to comply fully with the obligations it has assumed with the organization. So, Drago, I would like to start with you and to ask you if you can comment on the scenario, I think the global scenario and also Brazilian, and the main concerns of the working group of the anti-corruption agenda. What are the implications for business, multilateral relations, and the democratic rule of law? And also, if you could assess whether is a trend that we can follow in other countries, and what are the elements that support the weakening of this agenda?
Well, thank you, Paula, and best regards to your viewers. It's late here in Slovenia, but I know that it's just the perfect time for a conference like this one in Brazil. And thank you for inviting me. My plan for today's presentation is the following. First, I would like to present some general problems which we have identified due to COVID-19 crisis in the world. And then at the end of my presentation, to turn to Brazil and to tell you, your viewers, what the WGB, the Working Group on Bribery of the OECD, which I have the privilege to chair, is doing in relation to Brazil. So first, general things about COVID-19. See, when the first information came from China about threatening pandemic, everybody spoke about it, but nobody took it seriously. Now it's so serious that some politicians even speak about the war against COVID-19, like President Macron, for example. So what is usually happening in cases of pandemics? Let's say first, what usually happens is that medical and personal protective equipment is procured in a big rush. Second, supplies are being pilfered and prices are going up. There is an increase in substandard and fake medical equipment and pharmaceutical products. There are problems with healthcare workforce recruitment and management because countries need much more workforce in the area of healthcare, and there are big problems with recruiting it. There's a lot of petty corruption at the service delivery level. Sometimes healthcare workers ask for bribes for medicines. We also noticed cases where, let's say, citizens were offering bribes to medical workers or to police officers to avoid quarantine. There's opacity in the research and development of vaccines and medicines. We hear plenty of information lately, these days, that there's a new vaccine coming out in a matter of days. There's another one. One of them has 94% success rate. The other one has 95% success rate. And of course, we will have to wait and see. And it is very clear that those pharmaceutical companies, which should be the first ones entering the market, will earn a lot of money. And what is, let's say, really defining the activities of countries during the pandemic, like the current one, is that governments are focusing absolutely, well, majority of governments. We also have countries in the world, especially one big country, which is not Brazil, of course, where the government is not focusing at all on protecting their citizens' lives. And when this happens, governments usually disregard the need for the necessary monitoring in the areas. So we identify problems in many different areas. The first area is when where we identify problems is the area of rule of law. Now, when the pandemic started, so many countries, so many citizens needed badly the personal protective equipment. Of course, there was not enough equipment existing there. So what countries were doing, they were simply running against each other in this desire to procure the equipment. Then we saw some very typical fraud and corruption cases. Let's say delivering substandard equipment or even not delivering anything. We had countries, and unfortunately my country, Slovenia, is one of them, who were insisting on the use of intermediaries. So let's say my country did not want to buy medical and personal protective equipment directly. It insisted on intermediaries, forgetting completely that there is no brighter red flag for potential bribes and kickbacks. And this is what I think also happened in my country. Then it came to overpricing of the products or the transportation and so on and so on. So it all became so, it started to bring so much money that even mafia engaged in procurement of medical and personal protective equipment. So what to do to avoid those risks? It's very simple. There has to be increased law enforcement activities also during the time of pandemic. It is difficult because they also have to keep social distancing, maintain social distancing. It's very difficult because they have other priorities, but they still can do it. Next area which is problematic is public procurement. Easier and faster are the magic words here. And there are countries in the world, let's say, for example, China, China had a very good law enabling very smooth, fast, and simple procurement of medical and personal protective equipment. Some other countries, also the European Union, have started to develop legislation which made the procurement much easier and faster. But of course, if you're doing it faster and easier, that means you're abandoning the necessary control and monitoring. So we should not forget that it is necessary also to apply controls and monitoring and it has to be additional controls and monitoring because there is huge amount of money spent on the purchase of the equipment. Transparency. Some people see transparency as a silver bullet in the fight against corruption. It is not. By transparency itself, you cannot win corruption or defeat corruption. But it is also true that countries with high level of transparency have less corruption. In the, let's say, in circumstances like we are facing today, transparency is extremely important for every government for two reasons. The first reason is the following: fighting pandemic usually brings along some restrictions on movement, on let's say people working together, and so on and so on. So if governments are not transparent on what they are doing, if they're not transparent on their intentions, goals, measures, the citizens will not trust them, and this might become a serious problem for the governments, because the governments will not be able to control the pandemic. Let's say, again, here I have to point the finger at my country, because what we see here and what we saw in the last month is that people do not trust the government for many different reasons. And although I cannot say that our government is doing bad in the fight against corruption, no, the moves they're doing are basically exactly the same moves as all other governments around the world. But people do not trust the government, so they are not following the measures instructed by the governments, and we have a big problem. Let's say my country has the measuring in, let's say, the number of deaths on 10,000 persons. Our country is the worst one in the world today. But there's also another transparency which is important. This is transparency in using the public resources during the pandemic. Of course, the first type of resources which is used to being resources for purchase of equipment. The second type of resources are resources which are used as economic supportive measures for the economies suffering from pandemic. So if there is no transparency here, then of course governments will have serious problems, because citizens will start and organizations will start to suspect that there is something wrong. And normally there is something wrong if governments are suppressing the transparency. Functioning of different monitoring bodies. We saw cases where, let's say, where the oversight role of the parliaments was completely abandoned. The parliaments were not able to control the budgetary expenditure of the governments, which of course can have serious consequences. Normally in countries we have independent institutions, let's say anti-corruption commissions, agencies, courts of audit, and so on. If they do not, together with regular law enforcement agencies and prosecution services, focus on increased monitoring in those periods, then countries will see increase of corruption. Media play extremely important role in the time of pandemic, not only because they have to inform people on what is going on, and because they have to inform people what are the measures taken by the governments, but what is especially important for them during time of pandemic is that they have to deliver truthful information. When I'm saying this, I want to say that they have to be very careful not picking up fake news and deliver it to their audience. And fake news it's not always coming from, let's say, strange sources. Sometimes fake news comes from governments themselves. Sometimes governments, or let's say members of the governments, say things which are extremely stupid and even dangerous to their citizens. So media have a special responsibility to report truthfully in the time of pandemic. Of course, this will not always be met with happiness of the politicians. So we saw many countries where politicians are calling media as being erroneous, distorted, or politically motivated when they report things which politicians do not like. We also have cases of countries where politicians are using or misusing the pandemic to suppress the media even more than it was suppressed before. So we have to put a lot of emphasis on protecting the media freedom also during pandemic. The OECD has let's say, produced a research in June. Well, the OECD working group on bribery, we asked our member states, we have 44 member states, on what are the consequences of pandemic for their work in the area of foreign bribery, because this is what we do, or in corruption in general. And we have basically identified, let's say, problems such as change of priorities, lack of resources, lack of identification of risks, confinement measures as a restrictive element, delays in investigations, delays in judicial proceedings, and so on and so on. But we also realized some very good practices. Let's say, facing the pandemic, law enforcement agencies had to reorganize and they had to prioritize what they will be doing, and some of them did so. There was much more coordination in responding to emerging corruption risks. Use of new technologies has improved significantly. We are doing things which we would never think to do before. And there are some legislative developments, let's say, allowing virtual criminal trials, allowing, let's say, delays in expiry of the statutes of limitations. So we saw also things which were good. What was particularly, let's say, encouraging was the increased level of cooperation between the public and the private sector, because they realized, public and private sector, they realized that they have to work together. So this was the pandemic. Now on our work concerning Brazil, I'm sure you all know that, let's say, last year in, was it October, November, the working group on bribery visited Brazil in the framework of so-called high-level mission. We organize high-level missions to countries where we have special, where the level of our concerns is very serious. And last year we had very serious concerns about what is going on in Brazil. We also published a public statement, that's why I can discuss it. And we went to Brazil to discuss, let's say, some of the then decisions of the Supreme Court, tackling the ability of Financial Intelligence Unit to share its information with law enforcement. Then there was the decision of the Supreme Court on the ability of tax services to fight corruption, and so on, so on. So basically, we had identified 6 or 7 reasons why we had to go to Brazil. We went there. We had some fruitful discussions, and when we came back, let's say, not many, but some of our concerns were met from Brazilian side. Let's say the decision of the Supreme Court on the use of the FOI's information for law enforcement purposes has been, let's say, brought back to normal, so there's no problem there. We were discussing our report on high-level mission in December 2019. And since we realized that not all our concerns have been met in the proper way, we asked Brazil to come back with a report again in March. So Brazil came back in March, and it came back in June, it came back in October. We are still not satisfied with the level of, let's say, of the qualitative level of solutions which would, let's say, deal with our concerns. So we continue to monitor what is going on in Brazil. I cannot go into details because this has not been published yet, but I can tell you that we are very, very worried about the developments in Brazil. And this is one of the reasons why, let's say, Brazil will have to report back to us again in 2 weeks, because in December we again have the meeting of the working group. And I will stop here, and I'll be very happy if there'll be any questions later on.
Thank you, Drago. Thank you so much for your contributions. I think there is a lot. So Bruno, I think Drago brings some elements from the global situation, the pandemic situation, but TI was really focused here in Brazil to analyze the setbacks. So I really wish to ask you, what are the elements that characterize the setbacks in what did you find here?
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Instituto Ethos, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate again in the Ethos conference. This is a stage with a long history of contributions to Brazilian public debate in promoting important agendas in sustainability, human rights, and of course, fight against corruption and business ethics. It's also an honor to me to share this panel with someone I respect and admire a lot, champion of the anti-corruption cause. Great to see you, Drago. Unfortunately, not in person this time, but gladly not for the bad reasons you came to visit our country last year. Hopefully, you come for better reasons next time. Great to see you anyhow. I'd like to start with very short initial thoughts, and I would like actually to share a little story to begin with, a true story, actually an historical episode that is often forgotten, but it's quite important. In 1929, the mayor of the German capital, Berlin, was accused of corruption. Investigations revealed that Mayor Gustav Bob was involved in a scheme of fraud in procurement of uniforms for public officials in the city. And the material was sold by the Jewish brothers Leo, Max, and Willy Sklarek. They maintained a monopoly to supply these uniforms to the mayor through bribery. And as the result of the investigations, the Jewish brothers were arrested and the mayor resigned. This scandal severely shook confidence of the Berlin population in politics. This was thoroughly explored by the mythic machine, propaganda machine of the emerging National Socialist Party. And at the end of that year of 1929, in the aftermath of that corruption scandal, the Nazis won for the first time in history in the Berlin City Hall. And Transparency International always recalls that throughout history and in every part of the world, from time to time, the anti-corruption cause, the anti-corruption discourse is hijacked, is captured by populist and authoritarian political forces. This is unfortunately what we are living in our country nowadays. President Bolsonaro recently said in a speech that he would finish with Lava Jato. He would finish with the operation because it was not needed anymore. Because since he got to power, corruption ceased to exist in government. Therefore, the anti-corruption, the biggest anti-corruption operation in the history of Brazil and possibly in the world, next to Money Pulite in Italy, was not needed. It was obsolete now with his government. That would be comic if it wasn't tragic, because President Bolsonaro is not only finishing with Lava Jato, he's finishing, he's destroying with the conditions that allowed Lava Jato to exist in the first place. Because Lava Jato, Mensalão, Greenfield, and the many groundbreaking anti-corruption processes, investigations that we have seen in our country in recent times, they are not the result, they did not come out of the void, they did not appear from nothing. They are the result of long, slow evolution of laws, institution, and social awareness for the fight against corruption in Brazil. And this is precisely what is now suffering serious setbacks. What we are witnessing now is the progressive loss of independence, of oversight, and law enforcing agencies, namely the federal police, the federal tax revenue authority, the financial intelligence unit, and perhaps most important of all, the prosecutor general office. Second, the weakening of the anti-corruption legislation and jurisprudence. Not only this government failed to promote anti-corruption legal reforms, but it also allowed and was part of legislative process that is weakening the existing laws. Third, setbacks in transparency levels, attempts of weakening the access to information law. Most of them were blocked by either the Congress or the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, there were serious attempts to weaken this important legislation, but also the enforcement of this legislation. The right to information of the citizen is losing ground. We have seen statistics showing that how much the response from public authorities, the federal government, is losing, is weakening, losing quality and quantity of response to citizens in comparison to the previous years, the previous administrations. Fourth, and perhaps the most important, the reduction of civic space, the hostility against civil society organizations, activists, and the media. Drago mentioned the importance of investigative journalism to the fight against corruption everywhere in the world. No country has evolved in the fight against corruption without a free press, an independent press. And what we see now is the frequent rhetoric of hostility and attacks to journalists and activists in our country. And this group of setbacks that I would take much more than the time of this debate allows to describe all these setbacks, but they can be found in the documents that TI, Transparency International Brazil, is compiling and denouncing to authorities at the national and international levels since last year. Since 2019, we have been publishing these setbacks in both Portuguese and English to give great awareness, visibility to what is happening in our country. We do hope that the national organizations, multilateral organizations, can be a player to avoid further setbacks and hopefully revert some of these setbacks. And that is why we believe in the importance of the involvement of the OECD, the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the UNODC, UNCAC, and several other institutions. It's important to clarify that Transparency International is not against the international integration of Brazil. We are not against the ascension of Brazil to the OECD, or we are not against the free trade agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur. We are not against the ascension of Brazil to the World Trade Organization Global Procurement Agreement. We are in favor. We are in favor of the international integration of Brazil as long as it serves as drivers for the promotion of good practices and above all of rights in Brazil, citizens' rights. We do believe that the accession of Brazil to the OECD is an opportunity to promote better standards for public policies And among them, and I'm happy to be here to debate in more specifics with Drago, the head of the working group on bribery, a great opportunity to enhance our legal and institutional framework for the fight against corruption. And right now, unfortunately, what we have to focus is to stop the setbacks of these long established evolution, this long evolution that allowed Brazil in recent years to become an example in many ways, of course, with shortcomings and failures and errors, but nevertheless, calling attention of the world as a country that was truly committed to address its problem of systemic corruption, to revert the historical impunity of elites, to address grand corruption. And what we cannot allow is that all this progress that is the result of efforts of Brazilian society and institutions to be reverted back to impunity and the incapacity to address grand corruption. It's also important to say always that this is not exclusively to Brazil. We have seen, we witness setbacks in many countries. I can mention the United States itself in the last years, and many other countries that are suffering similar setbacks. And even the countries that enjoy a good level and maintain a good level of control of corruption in their territories, they still have a lot to do in their responsibilities to fight corruption and not to engage in corruption and foment corruption and profit from corruption when they do business abroad in countries like ours or other countries in Latin America or Africa. And this is the object of our report, Exporting Corruption, that we recently published, the last edition, denouncing the lack of enforcement of the OECD anti-bribery convention on transnational trade processes, the OECD anti-bribery convention. This is an important report that reminds that the problem of corruption is also a very important matter of the rich world. There's a lot of responsibility of the great exporting nations in the spread of corruption in the developing world. So great that the OECD is here to discuss within a moment like this. And I'd like to finish with some positive, a positive note. It's a bleak presentation, unfortunately, I had to make, but I always try to use this data to show that we have hope and all the elements to keep going, to keep progressing in the fight against corruption in Brazil. For one very important reason, we have a people, we have a nation, a society believes in the fight against corruption and believes in its own capacity to make a difference in the fight against corruption. We have Transparency International have been publishing the Global Corruption Barometer for some years now. It's one of the most important opinion polls on the experience and attitude of people around the world regarding corruption. And in the last editions, some results of Brazil were outstanding. One of them, very important, was the question that if the citizen believed that he could individually make a difference in the fight against corruption. The result in Brazil was that 83% of the sample responded that yes, they believed that they could make a difference in the fight against corruption. When we compile that with the regional publication in the Caribbean and Latin America, this was the highest response rate in the whole region. But when we compile with the other regions of the world, with a sample of 77 countries, we saw that the Brazilian rate of trust of its own people in its own capacity to fight corruption, to make a difference in the fight against corruption, was the highest in the world. It was the highest level in the whole sample of 77 countries, not the whole world, but the 77 countries assessed by the poll. So we can safely say that Brazil is one of Brazilian society is one, if not the society that most believe in the fight against corruption and in its own capacity to make a difference in the fight against corruption in the whole world. So that gives us hope. We can channel that through democratic means to a truly long-standing transformation process in the fight against corruption as a fight for rights. So thank you very much, and let's go to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you for finishing with some positive, because the setbacks are really bad for us that work with the fighting against corruption. Every day it's a little hard and to see all the scenario. So, well, I have one question to Drago here. And if you can talk about talk a little about the relationship between corruption and deforestation in the main tropical forests in the world and also in taiga in the north. How does this correlation become a fundamental point of control when it comes to the recovery of the economy?
I lost you for the second in the middle of your question, so can you please repeat it?
The whole question? Yeah.
Yeah, I lost the connection. So for the second, so that's why I didn't get the whole question.
Okay, how does the correlation between the corruption and deforestation becomes a fundamental point of control when it comes to related to the recovery of the economy? How does all these are correlated?
You see, no country has unlimited resources at its disposal. So whenever countries are trying to recover from any type of crisis, countries are having a limited amount of resources at their disposal. And in situations like we are facing today or in any other crisis, governments know that they have to be quick in applying those economic relief packages. And those packages are huge. We're talking about, let's say, it depends from the country. We're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars or euros, whatever. And if there is even the slightest level of corruption there, so much money will get lost. The money will not get to the final addressees of the money. It will not get to the people who need the money. It will not get to the companies which need the money. So the problem is that when governments are deciding on these relief packages and how to use them, first they have to fight their own temptation, which is normally to keep the part of the money for themselves. Now, I know so many governments around the world who I presume they might have serious difficulties to decide not to keep just at least the part of the money. But even if they don't do this on purpose, let's say it's difficult to arrange organizationally and structurally the use of huge amounts of money in the way which would prevent any form of corruption. Which means we don't only need the normal level of attention and the normal level of monitoring, which it's so important now that it should not only be entrusted to the public organizations, but civil society also has to be allowed to take part in this monitoring. So the normal level is not enough. We will have to increase the level of monitoring, increase the level of control. And only then we will be able to fight, let's say, corruption in, let's say, application of this recovery packages. Huge amounts of money will get lost, for sure. Let us do our best that those amounts will be as small as possible.
Right. Thank you. And Bruno, we are discussing a lot about the relation between corruption and deforestation here in Brazil also. And maybe you want to talk about, you who are the TI here are working with this team. Right.
Yeah, just to add a little bit from what Drago said about the limited resources and of course the corruption, it's waste of these common resources and common wealth of the nation, not only with the environment, but other types of wealth. And what I always try to bring to discussion is the nature of corruption in a context like ours. Now, we usually say here in our team in Transparency International in Brazil that corruption is not dysfunction. I think this is not a word in English, but it is in Portuguese, and I think people can understand dysfunction. It's not a dysfunction in the Brazilian state. Corruption is not something alien to the Brazilian state. It's not a dysfunction. It's perfectly functional to the type of state that we have. We have a state since its colonial origin that hasn't changed much, that has a purpose, a main purpose, which is to extract and concentrate wealth and rights to a part of the society in this regard to the whole rest. If you take statistics of inequality in comparison between Europe and Latin America, not only Brazil, we share this with our neighbors. If you take the inequality levels before and after you put the government in the equation, if you take the Latin American rate is something high. You take the European medium high. When you put the European government, the inequality rates shrink. When you put government, the Latin American governments, Brazilian government, inequality rates increase. So governments here, they have this purpose, and corruption, what it does is to accelerate this purpose, to make this machine of extraction and concentration of wealth and rights more efficient. So we need to tackle our problem of systemic corruption. We need to change the nature of our state and the relationship of this state with society, with the market. And for that, we need to tackle the root causes of these problems. And it goes through citizenship, to bring awareness of people of their rights, of their possibility to change their realities, the role of the democratic processes in these changes, that goes through that. So fighting corruption and its effects in the environment, in deforestation, in the health of the system, in the education system, and all that goes through promotion of a strong and aware, active, free citizenship. And that is why we are so concerned right now with a government that hijacks the anti-corruption discourse at the same time that it promotes the shrinking of civic space, the violation of fundamental rights and in its discourse and in this regard to minorities' rights, the rights of indigenous populations. So we cannot change our corruption systemic problem of corruption through this path, through the populistic authoritarian path. We have to step back and look from the ground to the, as I said, to the promotion of citizenship. Just to broaden your question, Paula, deforestation, yes, is related, but I think this is a broader systemic problem linked to corruption.
May I add something here on deforestation, because I didn't understand the question before. You see, for the external world, we simply cannot understand what Brazil is doing with its forests. You know, this is unbelievable. And I'm speaking now on my personal behalf. I don't speak as a chair of the Working Group for Bribery. No, the whole world knows, let's say, that Amazon forest is one of the most important natural, let's say, assets which Brazil has. And the forest is burning, and is burning more and more every day. So something is wrong, and something is terribly wrong there. And on something else, you see, although Bruno is really painting a bleak picture, he said something which is extremely important at the end of his presentation, that the readiness of Brazilian citizens population is the highest one in the world, the readiness to fight corruption. This is something which I think all other countries in the world can envy you, because this is not always the case. But this inevitably will lead to problems in the future of the country. Because if the governments, the current one, the future one, whichever government, will not even try to fight corruption, or it will pretend that it is fighting corruption, then it will have to pay the price, because the citizens will one day it will sanction it for not fighting corruption, because they are willing to do it. And if they will see that the government, and especially in countries like Brazil, now why Brazil is so important for the whole world? I speak well in general terms, but also in the terms of anti-corruption. Brazil some years ago was burdened seriously with corruption, and nobody saw a medicine for it. Then the Lava Jato case came, and the way how Brazilian police, prosecutors, and judiciary reacted to Lava Jato has proven that also countries which are deeply, let's say, troubled by corruption can do something against it, can fight it. Now, the bleak picture which Bruno has painted, it also could be understood in the way that things are going back to the times before Lava Jato case. That would be a real tragedy if this is really happening. This would be a real tragedy, not only for Brazil, but for the whole anti-corruption world, because it would mean that the results or the achievements in the anti-corruption area are reversible, and that we should never trust whichever results are achieved in this area, because the next day we can wake up in a country or in a region where fighting corruption is not important anymore, impunity is prevailing again, and corruption is prevailing again. So I really hope, well, I don't have any reason not to believe Bruno's words, but I really hope that it will not continue in the way as it was painted by Bruno.
Okay, Diálogo. Well, I have another question. We have some minutes yet. So you talk about the fragility in the face of the pandemic, but was a sign of this weakening even before the pandemic in Brazil and other countries, especially here in Latin America. And so what are the challenges and the main concerns that we need to address related to that? And we are talking about the Lava Jato, so how the setbacks impact strategic sectors here in Brazil, such infrastructure, energy, and the private sector integrity agenda? I think this last question is for both, right?
Let's Bruno start this time.
Okay, Bruno. We're not listening you, Bruno.
You're muted.
Yeah. Say, are you? We're not listening.
We can't hear you.
No. So I think we maybe you can get out and get in inside the room again, and then we start with Drago. We can start with the first question, okay? So then the second one is for both, so I can give it to Bruno. And so the first question is that you talk about the fragility facing the pandemic, but we have some signs before that. And so what are the challenges and the main concerns that we need to address related to this?
Well, you see, the fight against corruption is always exposed to many different risks. But there is a new one which emerged just some years ago. Let's say when Mr. Trump said America first, that was a purely economic statement, which I understood. I still don't agree with it, but which I understood. This say, my country first, has been picked up by many country leaders around the world, in the sense that they say, well, we don't care what is happening around us, we just care what we do in our country. With other words, nobody will tell us what we do because we are the smartest one in the world. So this increasing nationalism, or increasing, let's say, the emphasizing the importance of national sovereignty, it might be good in some areas. For sure, it is not good in the fight against corruption. We spent decades of building the global front against corruption. And now this is being, there have been attempts to take this apart. And it is not surprised that research shows that in those countries where the political leaders say so, that nobody will tell us what to do, no, the level of corruption is increasing. So this really brought huge fragility in global anti-corruption efforts. All other, let's say, risks for and let's say, speaking about how this can influence, let's say, the economy and so on. Let's say the relations between corruption and economy are basically very clear. The higher the level of corruption, the lower the development of economy. If you hire, let's say, high level of corruption means less foreign direct investments. It means less public expenditure. It means increase in taxes. So the data which Bruno has presented in his speech, they're really worrying. And I really hope that, first of all, that they're really not so bad as it seems now, and that things will turn back to normal. And normal for me, in the terms of Brazil, means the times where the whole Brazil was breathing anti-corruption through Lava Jato anti-corruption efforts.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Am I back? Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
fine.
good.
You want me to ask you again, or you remember the question?
No, I did listen to it, and I just tried to say that when Drago said that he hoped that we would not fall through this path of setbacks that we would revert to this normal. I just said I also hope I hope that too, Drago. But what I wanted to add to this reflection about what Lava Jato really changed in our country, and perhaps that has a bit more long breath for a long run. It's our professor here in Brazil, the professor of law, Joaquim Falcão, which is also a board member of TI Brazil. He says that Lava Jato is not an investigation, a criminal investigation, an anti-corruption operation anymore. For some time, it hasn't been that anymore. It is an attitude. And this attitude, and I'm expanding a bit of his thoughts, this attitude was something very positive within institutions like the prosecutor's office and the federal police, because it empowered young generations of prosecutors and law enforcement agents, judges, policemen, to believe that they can make something against grand corruption and the historic impunity of elites. It's not a fact of nature, immutable. It can be changed. This was very important. And now you see, especially the young, it's a generational shift that feels now that this is possible to do. And what Drago just said, it showed that it is possible. And most importantly, for law enforcing agents. This attitude also affected the people in Brazil, and in a positive way also, because it showed that, again, it is possible to fight against corruption. If you said 5-6 years ago that business tycoons, as we saw, would be serving jail time, or very powerful politicians also, that would be taken as a joke. Nobody would believe. You'd be laughed on your face. And now people actually believe, when the time will come of certain types, that people are still expecting justice to be made. Although they are losing faith, it's also true. But that has been changed, this attitude, in a positive way. However, this Lava Jato attitude also brought negative attitudes, and not necessarily by default the responsibility of Lava Jato itself. I don't blame the operation in itself, but it did create negative outcomes as well in people's attitude regarding corruption. When people saw that fighting corruption was putting people in jail all the time, this is important. To fight impunity, of course it's important, but no country in the world won the fight against corruption just through the penal solution, just through jail. Of course not. We need to change the system, as I said, to promote citizenship rights, to change the nature of our political system and the state. And now, when we have a populist government that understand that people is only craving for prisons, he can shift these prisons to the adversaries and actually do nothing against the allies. And this is easy to manipulate, this type of fight against corruption, by a populist government. This is very dangerous. So in a way, it was very important, an attitude to empower law enforcement agents to fight corruption and impunity, to give hope to Brazilian people that justice can be achieved also for the elite, to hold the powerful to account. But at the same time, it's hard to explain now to the people that the fight against corruption is victorious in the long term through the evolution of laws, institutions, social awareness. It's hard to explain and convince people of that now. People, unfortunately, wants to see jail all the time. And so it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that would be necessarily if we want to tackle this systemic problem. Of course, there would be disruption if we tackle that. And now we need to overcome that and keep going our fight against corruption through the democratic path.
Perfect. Thank you, Bruno. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and Dragon needs to rest because they have we have some different times, right? So I really want to ask you for a final message for you both, especially about the ways for us to face this kind of silent and authoritarian setbacks and to improve again a positive agenda in anti-corruption framework. So we can start with, I think we can start with you, Bruno, because Drago asked another time, right?
Okay, we leave the guest, the external guest. I feel more at home to finalize, but that's good because I'll finish with a provocation to Drago to provoke the reflection on the role of first, the role of civil society. What you think, Drago, is the importance of civil society? You already briefly mentioned that it's also important to monitor and the accountability is also necessary, the role of civil society, first of all. And second, what can the OECD do to stop setbacks, or at least to limit these setbacks, to mitigate these setbacks, and hopefully revert? And do you think the ascension process to the OECD can be a driver for the reversion of these setbacks and better practice, not only in anti-corruption, but possibly also in environmental issues and all that? What would be the role of the OECD? I'm posing a question to you as my final comments, if I may, Paula, if you excuse me.
Okay, it's fine. Yeah.
Well, it's always interesting to speak with people from TI, you know, so I like it. First, on the role of the civil society, you know, if somebody thinks that any government in the world can fight corruption by itself, it is wrong. It has to be the joint effort of the government, private sector, and civil society. So without active civil society, without a civil society which role has been recognized by the government, there will be no big and no long-standing results in the fight against corruption. On the second one, what can the OECD do? You know, OECD is extremely, let's say, structural organization. OECD deals with many different areas. Anti-corruption is just one of them. So when countries are trying to accede to the OECD, they have to get the green light of all working bodies of the OECD. There are 30 plus working bodies in different areas, and they all have to give the green light to the country. And let's say we in the working group, as one of those bodies, we take our work extremely serious. And I know that other bodies did do it too, which means that if countries are not fulfilling the conditions in particular area of those 30 bodies, they will not get the green light from this committee or this, whichever name it uses. And then the case cannot go to the, let's say, to the Council of the OECD for a decision. We had a case like that, let's say, just 2-3 years ago, with one country from Latin America. They look very enthusiastic at the beginning, but then we find out that basically they don't fulfill some of the basic requirements in our area. And we said to them, okay, do it please and do it fast, otherwise you'll have to wait a bit. They didn't do it and they had to wait. Now, let's say, normally the Council of the OECD makes a decision on adopting new let's say, approving new members in June every year. I'm afraid that due to pandemic, in June next year, nothing will happen because this is a very long process, a very complicated one, and very, let's say, a resource-intensive one. So for sure, not only for Brazil, for any other country. Nothing will happen next year. That means the next goal or the next window of opportunity will be June 2022. That makes quite a lot of time if countries want to improve. And I really do hope that when Brazil will be formally assessed as a country trying to exceed the OECD by our working group or by any other working group in the OECD, that Brazil will not face significant, let's say, problems, meaning that Brazil will be fulfilling all the basic requirements to join the OECD. And as I said, OECD is very diversified organization, so many things, OECD will check many things before any country, including Brazil, is entering the OECD. So the short answer to the question is, without any doubts, Brazil will have to be in its best condition to join the OECD.
Perfect. Thank you, Drago. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you so much for joining us today and for accepting our invitation. It was really good. It was a pleasure to be here with you both. Unfortunately, virtually, but it was really a pleasure. So I think that we're finishing our panel today. I'd like to thank you both, our audience and also our translators, and invite to everyone to continue following us, because next Thursday we'll have more panels, and Ethos conference keeps going until the December. So we have a lot of discussions here to do. So that's it. And thank you so much. For more information, everything, all the links are in the description. And thank you, and a good night. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Minerar na Amazônia é lapidar uma joia preciosa, joia que está embaixo do solo e sobre ele. Em plena Amazônia brasileira, a Alcoa desenvolve um projeto de mineração sustentável, da lavra do minério até a reabilitação das áreas, produzir bauxita de alta qualidade, superar todos os desafios e estabelecer um legado de sustentabilidade na Amazônia.
Em um mundo em transformação, como reinventar nossas ações? Nosso mundo mudou, está mudando, cada vez mais rápido. Vivemos o desafio coletivo de repensar nosso jeito de fazer. Somos convocados a descobrir novas formas de avançar, formas mais coletivas, sustentáveis e circulares. Isso pode ser feito, e é um exercício constante, um exercício do agora que pode transformar nosso futuro.
Esse vídeo é um oferecimento da Gol,
que faz parte do projeto Aproximando Distâncias. Dentro desse projeto Aproximando Distâncias, a gente vai ter uma loja virtual, onde a pessoa vai poder adquirir produtos e obras de artistas do Brasil inteiro.
Fortalecer os trabalhadores.
Dar um up no comércio, no turismo, somar força conosco.
Acesse o site aproximandodistancias.com.br e cadastre os seus produtos.
Muito obrigada.
Vamos lá?
O que um banco entende de saúde? Nada. Mas para enfrentar a pandemia ao lado dos brasileiros, o Itaú Unibanco doou mais de R$1 bilhão e criou o Todos pela Saúde. Agora, ao lado da Fiocruz e Butantan, vai ajudar a reformar fábricas para produzir vacinas contra a Covid-19.
O que um banco entende de saúde? Nada. Mas para cuidar de nós, que trabalhamos no banco, o Itaú está disponibilizando orientação médica remota e garantindo as melhores condições de trabalho a quem está trabalhando de casa, além de higienizar as agências, implementar políticas de distanciamento físico e distribuir equipamentos de proteção.
O que um banco entende de saúde? Nada. Mas o Itaú criou o Travessia, um programa que está apoiando mais de 20 milhões de clientes a proteger algo que também é importante para eles, a sua saúde financeira.
O que um banco entende de saúde? Nada. Mas para cuidar da saúde da Amazônia, lançamos 10 medidas para a proteção e desenvolvimento sustentável da região amazônica. O que um banco entende de saúde? Nada. Mas a gente sabe que tem muito a ser feito. Nascemos e crescemos aqui. E não vamos descansar até tudo melhorar. Porque não é preciso entender de saúde para entender o quanto ela é urgente nesse momento. Itaú, mais do que nunca, feito para você, feito para o Brasil.
We are at a watershed moment in reshaping our world. Through our 4 international companies, we want to promote a change on a global scale. It is time to make a commitment to life. Today, we commit to address the climate crisis by addressing climate change and the preservation of biodiversity. We commit to help create a world that is human right and humankind by ensuring a better organization and a decent living wage for all our people. We commit to embrace circularity and regeneration by moving beyond a circular economic model to create more than we take. But we can't do this alone. We are calling on citizens, businesses, NGOs, investors, peers, governments to fundamentally change the system together. Let's become the generation who shift from we can to we did. Join the movement.